Welcome to OzAsia Talks, a series of critical conversations exploring the cultural engagement of Australia and Asia in a post-pandemic world. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I'm currently on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge that Adelaide Festival Centre's OzAsia Festival takes place on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay respect to their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. My name is Annette, Artistic Director of OzAsia Festival, and in this session I'm in conversation with S. Shakthidharan. Before we begin, I encourage you to connect and engage with us on Facebook or YouTube, where all sessions in the OzAsia Talk series will be posted, and find out more about the series at ozasiafestival.com.au. One of our most celebrated new works on the Australian stage last year was a 3-hour epic, performed by 16 actors found after a worldwide search. Counting and Cracking swept up 7 prizes at the Helpmann Awards, including Best New Australian Work. It also won Best New Australian Work at the Sydney Theatre Awards, and the script took out Australia's Richest Writing Award, the Victorian Premier's Literary Prize. The creative force behind Counting and Cracking is Sydney-based writer, director, filmmaker, composer, musician and community leader, S. Shakthidharan. Shakti, welcome to OzAsia Talks.
Great to be here, Annette.
It feels really strange to call Counting and Cracking your debut play because it took you a while to make, didn't it?
Took a long time.
Yeah.
What were
the barriers to making it sooner?
Oh my goodness. Didn't make it easy for myself. Yeah. I think the first barrier was the complexities of a community that's been through a multi-decade civil war, and what role does the arts play in how that community finds itself after that. And then you have the added complexity of the diaspora, but we're not in Sri Lanka, so it's that community here. And once I started to get a hold of that, I actually thought I'd completed the most difficult task of the work, but I had news in store for me, which was that the industry was not really ready or interested, to put on a work like that. And it was just hard to get people to read a long script and hard to explain that we can do a work that its primary audience is the Sri Lankan community, but it has a universal story beyond that, and that there can be a core to the work of bringing a new audience into the theatre.
Yeah. And
then later on, it became incredibly difficult to cast. And then later on, one of the wonderful things about Belvoir, and there were so many, when they came on board, was that Eamon and my collaboration with him, nothing he did ever minimalised or decreased the work, So in fact, he expanded it, which was wonderful creatively, but made it even more expensive. And so the task of raising the money for that work was astronomical as well.
There's a few things I'd like to drill down into there a little bit, but you mentioned Eamon Flack, who directed the work, which had surprised me a little because I've been aware of this work for the many years you've been developing it as the director and as the lead creative. So to suddenly be co-producing it with Belvoir, which is fantastic, but suddenly having another director wading into the work which you have put years of your life into creating. How does that process work, and how do you protect the integrity of that?
Absolutely. It was a slow process, and even though there were all those challenges I mentioned earlier, you've reminded me that one of the good things about that was that other things could happen that couldn't have happened with a quicker development time. And some of the things that happened were getting to know Belvoir and getting to know Eamon, and perhaps we have to improve our credits system because the way that that show was made was collaborative, you know. And Eamon worked very closely with me on the script, and I worked very closely with him on the direction. And the truth of the matter is you know, that room, the rehearsal room, was 15 actors of South Asian heritage, one Yolngu woman, Indigenous, 3 musicians of South Asian heritage, me, and Eamon. So in terms of cultural weight, he was vastly outnumbered, and that he knew that, and it suited him fine. And the cast, this was our lives, that project. You know, nothing in that play is based on is a real person, but it is all inspired by real stories. And every injustice in that play, every complexity, act of refuge, death, life, is all a real thing for that cast, for their own families and friends. And so, you know, they were very heavily involved as well. And so I feel like we made that work together, and I wouldn't have been comfortable with any other process with someone else stepping in, directing it. We cast that work together, Eamon and I. I led the international casting for that. It was a real lesson for me in how Curious Works and Co-Curious and myself had expertise in certain areas, and Eamon and Belva had expertise in other areas. And we both brought our different sets of expertise to bear on that work. And I think that was crucial to its success. Yeah. And there's a kind of power that can be gained when people that don't normally work together, if you can navigate the different ways you think about the world and make art and learn how to collaborate across that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, given the way we are talking about work in the post-pandemic age, and what that means for the engagement between Australia and Asia. This is specifically what I'm thinking about for OzAsia Festival. How do we work together, and what are the barriers, and what needs to change to make things work better? So it's interesting using Counting and Cracking as a little bit of a case study, I guess, in that sense. And you had said initially that it felt like Australia wasn't ready for a work like that. I mean, let's...
the industry.
The industry
I definitely
wasn't ready.
think Australia was.
Yeah, okay. So we put aside that sort of the logistical stuff. Okay, a 3-hour work for anyone.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
You balk at, and casting a very large cast, all those sorts of things. But leaving that aside, the idea of this work, which comes out of the Sri Lankan diaspora, but is very much a story about Australia.
Absolutely.
As well as the civil war over there. Why wasn't Australia ready for that when so many of Australia's stories are about migrant stories and experiences from the old country?
Far out. That's a big question. For a long time now, I've been saying that there's this kind of battle going on in Australia's soul, for lack of a better word, I think between asking people to come here to discard parts of themselves to fit in, and asking them to come here to bring their full selves and expand what this country can be. And I think that we have, over the last decade and a bit, moved much more into the former camp than the latter. And at its best, Australia has been a land of refuge since people started coming here from South Asia and Southeast Asia thousands of years ago. People of Chinese heritage hundreds of years ago. And then, of course, you know, the first fleet and the boats from a few hundred years ago. So there is a version of Australia that we could all choose to believe in, which is that it's always been a migrant nation, and that there's an ongoing exchange between its earliest inhabitants and the migrants who've come since. And I feel like that's what it really is, and that most of that exchange has been with Asia, right? And that's its most long-lasting one. And I feel like that's the truth of our history and the truth of our being. And if we embraced it more readily and in our everyday lives and in the arts, then we would be more ready for more shows like Counting and Cracking. But we don't embrace it. We embrace a different version of Australia which says, everyone is welcome here, but here are the conditions. And those conditions over time dehumanize us. And they don't offer anyone, including the Anglo-Celtic majority, they don't offer any of us the best possibilities of what we could be. And I think part of our role as artists is to figure out ways to recover that humanity and offer stories that lean us towards that other camp, where we can re-embrace this country as a country of refuge for all of us.
I'm very interested in this idea of Australia as a place of refuge. It's something that underpins our engagement with Asia for many decades now, and many generations of people who have come here seeking sanctuary from whatever troubles at home. And you know, that shift from maybe in the 70s, when there was influx of people coming after the war in Vietnam, where they were opened with welcome arms, and where their contribution to Australian society now is absolutely celebrated. They've contributed so much, which is a deep contrast to the way we deal with people who come here now as asylum seekers.
There was a time when Villawood Detention Centre didn't have barbed wire, where people were given English classes and taken on trips to the harbour to see what Australia was like.
It's very different. I mean, even when I watch, some of these documentaries about the old rock and roll bands, like Cold Chisel and guys like that, who also arrived and were in, in those sort of, well, they weren't called detention centres in those days, were they? Just in immigration centres, and that's where they had their first taste of Australian life.
That's
and
right.
away they went from there, and that really should be the way it is for everyone. But now it is like a concentration camp. And so this very, very worrying turn of events has left a scar on the community. And for many years, and this is one of the reasons why it was surprising to talk of Counting and Cracking as your debut play, because for many years you've worked with those communities and the stories that they have to tell.
Yep.
And I'm sure the stories of refuge are very strong. There's a very strong strand there.
One of the things that I think has been missing from the debate around how we work with people who come here as asylum seekers has been that we haven't acknowledged enough how their stories have been used as a political football. I think the complexity of working out how to welcome as many people as we can and ensure that as few people die as possible in the seas could be something that could be embraced by a majority of Australia. And it would need a narrative which said that we are a land of refuge and we want to welcome people, and we must, it is our responsibility as a leader in this region, Asia Pacific, find a way to do that as safely as possible. And that should be separate to, that should be the beginning narrative, and then separate to then the way that we then do that practically. Instead, what's happened is been, which I think is kind of sickening, that we know that people want to come here, that they will be desperate enough to pursue whatever measures they can to do so. And many forces have found it politically convenient to use that act as a means of asserting that other type of Australian narrative, that we are a isolated, prized, elite location that people should feel lucky to step their foot on, and whatever you have to suffer to get in through the door is what you have to suffer, and you really shouldn't try. And when, in terms of being an artist, I think, and this will lead, I think, to some of the other things we talk about perhaps, but where we've lost that fight, I think, a little bit in terms of asserting that we should be a place of welcome first and then work out the safest way to do it, has been not giving enough space to those who have lived experience to be front and center of that debate. And if our industry isn't good enough at empowering them and enabling them to be at the forefront of recovering their own humanity, on that front. And we've kind of lost that battle. People still don't know enough about their actual lives and their reasons. And there are so many kind of fundamental things about being a migrant or a refugee that are still confused or lost, I think, in people's minds, in the broader public. Like just simple things like no one wants to leave their homeland. And they do it because they feel they have to. And then you come to Australia, and then it is such an incredible place of welcome on the streets for many. And there are so many little stories of how people embed themselves here to find a version of themselves they couldn't have found in their homeland. And we don't celebrate those either, And so I think this really sad thing has happened over the last kind of decade and a half, where the entire story of what it means to be a migrant or a refugee and what Australia's role is in that has been warped. And we've forgotten, actually, that the entire country is built on a history of migration, and that's why we are what we are.
So your work is actually a very powerful way of drilling down into that by actually working with people and hearing the stories of their lived experiences. I mean, before Counting and Cracking, there was so much work you did with your companies, Curious Works and Co-Curious, in working with communities, in giving them the tools and ways in which to tell their stories through performance or digitally, through video. A very empowering thing for them to be able to stand up and share those stories with the people they now live with, who are their neighbours. But when you go to making the sort of work you are now working, such as Counting and Cracking, which is presented in festivals and grand theatres all over the country, do those people who are telling those stories, do they get a chance to see their own stories in that context? Do they go and pay the big bucks to get the big tickets? Do they feel comfortable in the big theatres that we're offering for these kinds of work? Is there a disconnect there between where the stories are coming from and that power of people being able to see their stories shared?
I think there's, in the broader industry, a very good chance of that disconnect, which I do agree is happening, could become entrenched, and that the push towards diversity means changing up the kind of diversity you see on stage without changing up too much the process by which that happens. But certainly in my practice, I've worked really, really hard to make sure that doesn't happen. And
so what do you do that's different? How do you prevent that happening?
Well, you decide the primary audience from the very beginning. I mean, the primary audience for Counting and Cracking was the Sri Lankan community. And that's primary. It doesn't mean it's not a universal story for a big audience, but it means some really crucial things from the beginning. It means, one, making sure the presenting partners know that. Seems simple, but, you know, and I think it's an amazing business opportunity, you know. Obviously, that's not why I do it, but why wouldn't a presenting partner want to bring in people who never normally come to the theatre into their theatre? But it also means a long-term commitment. You know, it means that, so we had a really interesting journey with Canning and Cracking because I started talking to the community about it years before the show was on. And obviously they knew about it already because the process of writing that script involved talking to dozens of people here and around the world, Sri Lankans. And so, and then casting that work also involved talking to dozens, maybe in the end, close to a couple of hundred of Sri Lankans. And so it was already out there. But because this hasn't been done in Australia much, a work of that scale, and essentially the play, for those who haven't seen it, kind of attempts to tell the story of a family over 4 generations. But through this family, we kind of get a version of the modern history of Sri Lanka and a picture of contemporary Australia. And so you say those things to a community and they're like, what are you on about? Like, what are you talking about? And so it was very hard to convince them to come en masse, not because they were against it at all, but because they just weren't clear what the hell I was talking about. And then obviously that was kind of partly true because I was like, well, I don't know what it's going to be like either. We're on this together. Then the show had its premiere and its first preview nights, and the word spread like wildfire through the community. But we had a weird problem because it had sold out. It sold out before opening night. And so they all went nuts trying to get tickets, finally convinced, and they couldn't. They couldn't get tickets. But the ones who did get tickets, it was such an, I think, incredible experience because there are 6 languages in that play, and it opens with Tamil. And so you're in Sydney Town Hall, and then the first words you hear are Tamil. You know, the kind of the most colonial building in Sydney, really, starts with another language. And there are sections of that play, you know, and Eamon was really good about this. Like, he was on board the whole time, which are for the Sri Lankan community. Like, there are bits of Act 2 at the middle of the play which would be shorter if your primary audience was different. But it had to do with what my community and what we needed to sort out using the act of storytelling. It was a process of truth-telling, of healing, of reconciliation that was really important to us. And it's a confronting process. It meant revisiting trauma for a lot of people. So that took time, but Eamon and Belvoir were always on board with that. And so I think an audience can feel that, you know. And I love that process of reversing. You and I have, you know, God, if not for Eat Carpet and things like that, and you've been such a pioneer, but we've grown up, aside from things like that, trying to find ourselves through other people's stories. And I love that as in Australia, we have the opportunity now to present shows where the majority community will happily realize they are not the primary audience for this, still love the show, and part of the experience is reversing that, knowing that, you know, someone else is really seeing themselves here, and that that's part of an artistic experience too. And then we were going to put on a show called Jungle and the Sea this year, and it got postponed because
So Jungle and the Sea is a work that you're doing with your mother?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
She's in it. She's a dancer, and this was going to be her kind of main stage acting debut. She was a child prodigy, and she's an incredible guru and performer who's performed around the world. But
we are speaking, of course, of Ananda Valley.
Ananda Valley, yeah.
Yes.
And but it got postponed because of COVID. But we learnt, you know, and so that in terms of audience and community, I think there's a thing there with there's just practical things like I made sure now they were ready, you know.
Right.
And now they were like, what's the next show? That was their first thing they said after seeing Canning and Cracking. And so I was so excited by that because it was like there were hundreds, maybe thousands of people now who felt that the theatre was a part of their relationship with their sense of who they were, and that they were hungry to come back for more. And you can, I think, see there a picture of what a theatre can be as necessary to a community and part of its long-term working out of all the stuff that's too difficult to talk about at the dinner table, you know, and that you need the way stories wrap up complexity on stage to do it for you, to help you process the big things. And we'll continue that relationship when we can put on that kind of theatre again. And the final thing I'll say in that is I think it was the first time they realised that their story, and probably for me too, could be part of the Australian story. And I mean that by saying a lot of first generation migrants in particular will come here, they have economic opportunity they couldn't have had in their homeland, and they've accepted the deal that that's enough. And their cultural consumption, their sense of who they are and how they think and what they do can come from watching satellite TV or listening to SBS radio and kind of knowing that that will never be Australia's culture. And now with more generations here, we have the ability to shift that and to put that show on in Sydney Town Hall and have, at the end of every show, I always saw when I was there, the Sri Lankans kind of looking weirdly at everyone else giving standing ovations. And then the first thing that always come and say to me is, I like the show, Shakti, but I don't know why anyone else likes it. And then it took me a while to work this out. And I was like, yeah, it's like, this is a process of them realizing that each migrant community that's come here has made a contribution to this country. And we too are part of that Australian story. And why shouldn't that be celebrated in Sydney Town Hall? You know, and it doesn't have to be relegated to the places where multiculturalism happens, you know?
Yeah.
And it's a big, long process.
It is.
So we need this kind of long-term thinking to help communities go through all of that.
Yeah.
But how much better are we for it, you know?
Absolutely.
As an industry, as a country.
Yeah, and I think that for theatre to survive and thrive in this country, it has to speak to its community, and its community in Australia now, our society is incredibly diverse.
Yep.
But our theatre audiences still are not. And so what we put on the stage needs to reflect what we see out in the streets, and the people who come into the theatres need to reflect the people who are walking up and down outside the theatre.
Yep.
It just makes perfect sense.
Yep.
And it's a transition that's long overdue.
Long overdue. And the reason I think it's long overdue is because, sorry if I cut off your actual question, that is because the system of making that work has to change. And that's what people are afraid to do. Yeah. You know?
You reminded me of a work that I made with 3 refugee families. It was called Who Speaks for Me, in which there would be 2 or 3 people in each family, and the first one would tell their family's story in their own language and be translated by the other person, who quite often would have been like mother and child or something like that. And so you get that experience, which you and I both know, of being the child, having to be the voice for the family. And how that affects dynamics and that awful responsibility of having to be, you know, the front for your family. And then when the family comes to Australia, it switches to English. The first person has eventually learnt to speak English, and then the story continues about the whole family. And it was an incredibly powerful work.
Yeah.
And at the end of opening night, it got a standing ovation. And a couple of the actors, a couple of the storytellers came over in a terrible panic. Why is everybody standing up? Have we done something wrong? And it's because none of them had even been into a theatre before as audience members to really understand it. And the theatre, our performance spaces can be intimidating places. And I often wonder, are they the right places in which to accommodate these very powerful stories and experiences? I mean, the way you've described your work, it's
communal.
It's communal,
Yeah. And I completely agree, and I think we're in a really interesting time right now, because the impact of COVID has been to force people into thinking about their local community a lot more. And it really, for me, connects to Australia's place in Asia in really interesting ways when you look at it through an artistic lens, because our artistic practices, our ways of making work in terms of our traditions, are all much more embedded in community than contemporary Western theatre making, you know. And like my mother's practice comes from a tradition where the rhythm that a dancer, she's a Bharatanatyam dancer for people watching, which is one of the classical Indian dance styles. The rhythm that a dancer's feet moves to, first taught as syllables to speak, and they're also taught to a percussionist who learns those rhythms. And so there is immediately a shared language between music and dance. And those rhythms, before that, originally were modeled on the way a deer might move through a forest, or the way that the waves might land on an ocean shore. And all of those imageries of nature in the Tamil literature are firmly embedded into how, as humans, we think and feel. And our classical literature has different landscapes and different times of day for different emotions and feelings. And all of the songs and dances and mythical stories and contemporary stories that are continued on with this in that system are all that part of what people do as their everyday life. Songs they might sing while they're washing clothes or visit a temple or get married. And so there is such an embedment, I made up that word I think, of integration of art, what your community is and how you think about the world, that I'm starting to know exists in so many different Asian cultures, traditions, and of course is absolutely wonderfully sophisticatedly embedded into Indigenous artistic practice as well. And so I feel like there is a space there for us to start acknowledging the solidarity that exists between certain Asian practices, certain Asian Indigenous practices. But the challenge for us is that we're not going to just do those traditional practices. That's the wonderful thing about Australia, but also the complex thing, because we're all of us here together. So then it's kind of like going, okay, what is the contemporary manifestation of these artistic practices? And it's the new ground for us. But if we do it, it is so in line with making a theatre that is, and a performance culture that is absolutely necessary to community. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's been there for thousands of years, and it just takes the courage and the thinking around how to bring that into how we now do culture in Australia. Which is a really exciting opportunity.
Very exciting, and to think of traditions, theatre traditions, performance traditions that could be in danger of being preserved in aspic.
Yeah, exactly.
What relevance can it have to contemporary life, where we're so rushing around, where the pace of life is so different to the pace when those traditions began? We're bombarded by images, we're online constantly, bombarded by pixels. How can those ancient art forms and practices evolve to still speak to us in the pace of life that we live now?
In 2 minutes, you're not saying that?
Sure, you're the genius.
I'm not.
No, that's the challenge,
think
isn't it? But it's very exciting what it opens up in terms of ways of changing the forms that we're used to working with.
What's really there's kind of two things there that are really interesting in what we can do. The first is that that all of those things, the increasing digitalization of the world and the increasing kind of individualism of the world and tribalization, means that people love good theatrical experiences when they happen. This is why I think music festivals remain a perennial favorite in Australia on a subconscious level, because we freaking need that communal experience. It is a spiritual experience, whatever the musical artist happens to be, to have masses of people outdoors. When you sing together, you realize we're not as different as we think we are. And so I think the more our world becomes like that, the more their unspoken hunger is for the theatrical experience.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that we've got to figure out a way to hack away at technologies to serve our interests again. You know, I've been playing this mobile phone game, which I don't normally do at the moment, which is a series of, it's called Bury Me, My Love, but it's a series of text messages, that's all the game is, between a husband who's in Syria and his wife who chooses to try and flee to Germany. But it's just a series of text messages. But suddenly it's like giving me a positive reason to look at my phone. And it uses the fact that a conversation by messenger takes time over months, you know. And so you'll get a message from her and then she'll be busy. Like, so the time of it is based on when she can message or not. And I just think that all these technologies are actually incredible, but they're being used at the moment to fit this former narrative I've been talking about fitting in, limiting ourselves, reducing our humanity. But within them remains the potential to do the opposite, actually. You know, it's not the technology itself, you know. And so we have to figure out a way to hack away at them, to bring them back under our power.
Yeah, yeah. That sounds like a game you could seriously get addicted to, I think, following two people's intimate lives like
exactly.
that. Wow. Simple but powerful. Now, you were talking about, you know, all the commonalities between different Asian traditions and cultures and linking with Indigenous culture and practices. Sounds like a great introduction to what you're doing now. Tell me about the new work that you're developing, Stay.
Yeah, so it's called Stay, or Tsu. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it's a collaboration between Sada Collective and Kurunji. And so I've stepped away from Curious Works, who are still going strong, and I'm only, an artistic lead at Co-Curious and doing my own work through Kurunji now, which is a big change for me because I've been working with communities and supporting their stories for like 15 years. And so starting to spend more time focusing on my own work for the first time, done my career in reverse. And this collaboration was fascinating for us because when we met with the artists from, the Australian artists, May Falzon, who has a mixture of Anglo-Celtic and Maltese and Libyan heritage, and then Jasmine Shepherd, who's an ex-Bangara dancer, who is a Tagalak woman from remote Queensland, but also has Chinese heritage. And then we met with Sada Collective and from Singapore, and we had extremely strong similarities and extremely strong differences. And the similarity was what I was talking about before, was like unpicking what was at the roots of all of our artistic practices was an insane solidarity with a communal artistic practice with a close relationship with the natural world and integrated across many different art forms, you know, text, music, design, movement, and a kind of artistic practice that's intermingled with life seamlessly. And we had that in common, even though we were all from very different places. But the geography of our experience was very different. And May and Jasmine both grew up in different parts of remote Australia, and May rode a horse to primary school, you know, and Jasmine lived on the kinds of estates in remote Queensland. Her family, you know, that would, you know, take it's one property would take days to drive across, you know, and so that kind of vastness and that kind of closeness with nature was unimaginable, literally, to the Singaporean collaborators. And the thing that really stuck with me was them talking about how they don't really have any memories of properly seeing the stars, you know. And the kind of what we realized was that there was a story there about I'm just pausing because I don't want to give away the plot too much, but but there's a story there. What happens is the show opens with the discovery of two skeletons, and a farmer who's been on her land for 5 generations finds 2 skeletons at the bottom of a dried up creek bed during drought, and the cows have discovered it. And we find out that one of those skeletons has Aboriginal heritage, the other Chinese. And the link that kind of helped us with this was knowing, was the possibility that those Singaporean collaborators, that their ancestors might have come to Australia, to remote Queensland, hundreds of years ago as a part of the gold rush. And we know that some of them did, and some of them intermarried, and that's why Jasmine has Chinese heritage. And we saw there that there was a way to link Singapore and North Australia's history in a way that was completely a picture of Asia, you know, and didn't have to worry about the rest of the world. And that when we dug more into it, we saw how much opposition there was to that, you know, and that the birth of the White Australia policy kind of in part was to do with a fear in some politicians about the emerging solidarity between some of the Chinese indigenous communities and the not necessarily just what was happening there on the ground, but the prospect of what that could mean for a loss of power and face in terms of how the country might change. And, you know, just wonder what we might have been like if we had instead fully embraced all of those cultures, white, East Asian, indigenous in that area, to grow and flourish equally together from that time.
Yeah.
You know, what Australia would be like.
Yeah.
And the show really looks at the idea that we have to remember that time and find a way to reconnect to it. And that this farmer, you know, her land is being racked by those poor Queensland farmers went through all those years of drought, and then they got rain, and they thought it was a miracle, and they went out and danced, and then the rain didn't stop. You know, and we have to find a way to manage the land that thinks beyond the next generation or the generation after, and returns us to how we kind of take care of it for those future generations. And in this show, she does that by finding solidarity with the person who's a descendant of those indigenous bones. And the Chinese character learns that her ancestor, who she's finally found on that Australian outback, is as much Australian as Chinese, and that maybe his bones should rest there, and don't need to come back to China, and Singapore, which is what she's always wanted to do. And the fact that remote Queensland can be a picture of multicultural solidarity is not how Australia is normally talked about, but those who spent time there know that it absolutely can be.
Yeah, it seems to me that the history of Australia is very different from Northern Australia to Southern Australia.
Absolutely.
And many years ago I worked with a filmmaker who's, in fact there have been historians like Professor Reynolds who says that the great divide in Australia is not between the country and the city, but between north and south.
Interesting.
Because in Northern Australia, in places like Darwin and Cairns, far north Queensland, prior to Federation, it very much was a case in Darwin of a very big Chinese influence. That's where my great-grandfather came to in the 1870s.
Exactly.
Part of that sort of pioneering group of Chinese who helped establish what is now the modern-day Darwin. And of course, they had to get along with the people who were already there, with the First Nations people. And so there was a lot of intermingling and intersection between those communities. And of course, many of the men who came to establish businesses or later came for gold didn't find gold. They couldn't afford to go back. They didn't have the opportunity to go back and be the heroes of their communities in China.
That's right. They often didn't go back out of shame as well.
They had to stay here.
Yep.
And so their option then was to stay and be lonely men, or to get with it and integrate and marry. And quite often the white women would not marry them, so they would marry Indigenous women or Irish women who were also low on the social ladder apparently. So this was a very common story. one that we don't hear about.
You don't
very
hear
often.
about enough, you know. And it's so, I love it because it is, the Anglo-Celtic story is as wrapped into that as everything else, you know. And you feel it in those North Australian towns. You feel that it is part of Asia. It has a more similar climate. You feel that, like I'm of Sri Lankan heritage, obviously, and when I sit outside and talk to aunties in the North Australian Indigenous community, I feel like I'm with my aunties, you know, in Sri Lanka, and it's how do I put this delicately? There might be some, of course there is this kind of subconscious style of racism in a lot of those communities from some white communities that haven't spent a lot of time with lots of different cultures, but they are not, but they're also like way more grounded and open and living with many cultures than I think some of our city communities are. Do you know what I mean? Where we have this intense multiculturalism here, but
it's pretty superficial.
Yeah. You know, it doesn't have that generations of history behind it.
Yeah.
It doesn't have that generations of intermingling behind it. And there's something to be learnt from that. You know, us in our city, the way we talk down so often to rural Australia, the way that we have consistently not embraced what it really can offer to our image of what Australia is, you know, and like, isn't that what Australia is? I mean, that's what's unique about this country, isn't it?
Yeah.
All of those parts of the country.
Yeah.
So it's been a real joy kind of living in that world instead of my usual, you know, Western Sydney. There's a very different form of multiculturalism here.
Yeah, I'm thinking, you know, in our broader question of how Australia engages with Asia, and there have been, you know, so many reports and so many strategies and all those sorts of things and ways to do it. But really what it comes down to is people sitting down and sharing their stories and experiences in a way that is deeply and profoundly meaningful for both.
Absolutely agree.
And that's the foundation for everything, really.
Yep, and that there's a commitment, you know, I think, to that process, because sometimes that takes years. Yeah, and that people find the time for that.
and it's also about the complexity of it. I mean, you know, going and attending a conference and doing business courses and whatever, you don't get to understand another culture. To understand another culture, you have to know what makes people laugh and what makes them cry and what they think is beautiful and what they think is repulsive. And that really comes through what we are doing, through the storytelling and sharing of real life experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so, you know, what I've learnt from being a community artist for 15 years before kind of this next stage of my work has been that there is a process for this already. You know, we're one of the best in the world at it, actually, Australia's community arts industry. And there is a process that we have in the arts which is an antidote to so many of the arts industry's issues around representation, but is also a way of what you're talking about, helping people come together and sit at the table and share and find a way to trust each other over the course of however long it takes. And then to take that next brilliant stage of enjoying it.
Creating beautiful things together.
That whole second part of the story of bringing your full self and expanding what the country can be. But we have the process. You know, we just need the willingness from our leadership to actually use it.
Well, Shakti, it's time to embrace that word leadership for you and I. You're doing it. And so I think we have to take the responsibility of continuing to do it, our bit too, as leaders, because the will is there. And on that note, I think that's a good place to finish our conversation. I've really loved sitting down and having the time to chew over all these really, you know, complex, challenging, but ultimately very exciting ideas
It's been an absolute pleasure to be able to talk to you about some of this stuff.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to seeing Stay, because
Me
in
too.
a way it's a little bit reflects my family story
Yeah.
too.
Yep.
So
I feel that
gosh,
responsibility.
fingers crossed. let's hope we can see it at OzAsia sometime.
I hope so.
Yeah, thank you, Shakti.
Thanks, Annette.
Thank you for listening to In Conversation with S. Shakthidharan as part of OzAsia Talks 2020. We'll be posting new videos every week from the 20th of October to the 3rd of November. Watch and engage with us on Facebook using #OzAsia or visit ozasiafestival.com.au for more information.